The word bigot comes from the phrase by gott or by God. It refers to a person who holds an opinion or a narrative firmly despite countervailing evidence or contradictions. Unfortunately, the left tends to abuse this term to refer to anyone who holds racialist or nationalist beliefs or anyone who believes in certain stereotypes. This is a problem because stereotypes can be quite accurate in some cases, and a person can make sound evidence-based arguments for nationalism and racialism. As such, many instances of leftists condemning the national right as bigoted are a misuse of that term. They, for example, call Jared Taylor a bigot, despite Jared actually having formed his views on the basis of sound data and evidence, rather than on misinformed stereotypes. And of course, since a bigot is just someone who holds onto false narratives, leftists can be bigots too. And in fact, they are often the worst bigots in the room, such as when they disparage rural people as unintelligent and backwards. But since I've already made a polemical video on leftists, this time I've decided to turn my critical attention toward conservatives. I'm going to make a statement that might sound very shocking. I think conservatives are greater bigots than the best of the far right. I mean that in the proper sense of the term bigot, meaning that they hold beliefs that exist without respect to, and frequently in spite of, evidence to the contrary. In this video, I will examine several stereotypical ideas that conservatives believe in and explain how and why they are examples of simple bigotry. The first stereotype is related to the subject of welfare dependency. Conservatives tend to stereotype welfare recipients as lazy parasites who, quote-unquote, don't want to work. This is the basis for them to condemn all welfare programs as unfair to the working public, and in fact, they will go even further and argue that welfare hurts its recipients by dulling their desire to be productive or to strive for higher positions in their careers. Stefan Molyneux called this the welfare cliff, and the basic logic behind it is that since welfare recipients only receive welfare within a certain income bracket, they have an incentive to stay in a condition of impoverishment rather than to work harder and climb out of it. I will address this shortly, but first I want to tackle the stereotype that welfare recipients are lazy. In the first place, it has to be said that even if we assume they are lazy, laziness has underlying causes. Probably the most widespread is chronic depression, which destroys motivation and leaves sufferers unable to exert the high degree of energy required to work hard. In our fast-paced and often stressful modern world, depression is becoming more widespread, and most treatment for it is completely ineffective. Another reason for this so-called laziness, which is relevant to this alleged welfare cliff, is the lack of advancement opportunities in the economy, which is particularly relevant in rural areas and among the uneducated. If there's not even the remote possibility that your work will be rewarded, you don't actually have any incentive at all, welfare or not, to invest much in your labor and networking. Many people in today's economy feel defeated because they know that there are few, if any, job openings that will allow them to climb a career ladder. Even getting entry-level positions is difficult, if not impossible, for most people, even people who have freshly graduated from college. As such, the problem of poverty and this alleged laziness are systemic problems, not the result of character flaws. But conservatives don't even want to solve systemic problems because they believe these result from the natural functioning of the market and as such are not problems at all. Either that, or they believe that solving it will have negative economic externalities that simply result in moving the problem somewhere else. But this latter concern typically only considers the well-being of society's most wealthy people, as well as overall economic efficiency and GDP, rather than the well-being of the common weal. It's positive that conservatives are turning against legal immigration, such as H-1B visas, since this would ameliorate the problem to some extent, but most conservative politicians are not cognizant of the fact that doing so would actually help alleviate the issue of poverty and thus of welfare dependence for the native population. Conservative politicians, since they are simply defenders of the rich bourgeoisie, are generally in favor of this legal immigration, and in some cases, even of illegal immigration. So despite the conversation trending in a much more populist direction, the toxic combination of anti-welfare bigotry and policy that maintains the forces that impoverish natives persists. We might also note that the underdevelopment of places like the Rust Belt contributes to poverty and thus to welfare dependence as well. But since conservatives champion the free market, they don't want the government to invest in these regions at all. If we leave it up to the market, all the wealth will just concentrate in cities and on coasts, leaving the rural poor behind. As such, conservatives complain about welfare dependency without bothering to examine or even address the underlying causes, which they simply attribute to character flaws on account of the poor. It's a clear example of naked classism and egoism rather than a genuine argument. This bigotry often comes with another form, the claim that welfare is frequently abused in the United States, and as such, that welfare is a massive liability and typically used by unscrupulous people. This, however, is largely false. In 2016, only 1,162 people were convicted of welfare fraud, and estimates of the total cost of such fraud comes in at only $335.7 million. That might sound like a lot, but consider that the total cost of Social Security in the United States is $1.244 trillion in 2022. The welfare fraud is thus only 0.03% of the total Social Security budget. The narrative that conservatives tell of perfectly capable and prosperous people profiting from benefits en masse is completely false, and yet politicians continue to tell this bigoted story, that welfare is simply used by leeches and cheats. Finally, the conservative picture of the average welfare recipient, a black single mother who is too lazy to work, doesn't describe the actual reality in 2025. In the first place, the only ways to receive Social Security are either to have a disability, and the process of getting disability is lengthy, rigorous, and difficult, or to be of retirement age. Second, Republicans have actually passed work requirements for food assistance, and so those who rely on it to eat are actually productive members of society, as if it would be wrong to allow non-productive people to eat anyway. All this means that getting on welfare in the United States is actually very difficult, especially compared to countries like Norway and Sweden. Conservatives spin narratives that assume a lazy person who doesn't want to work can just show up to a welfare office and get benefits the next day. It doesn't work like that. Because of conservative efforts, these systems are very selective and have a whole host of rules that determine eligibility. And yet they still want to gut these systems anyway, relying on the same tired old bigoted narratives. Finally, I must note that half of those who receive food assistance are white, and the majority of those who rely on Social Security are also white. The idea that welfare is a specifically black or immigrant service is nonsense, and this is so much the case that I've seen those on the far right arguing that Republicans, since they want to cut benefits that are used by majority white people, are implicitly anti-white. That's the sense in which I think conservatives are genuinely more bigoted than the far right. On my channel, I've made several critiques of conservative intellectuals, such as Paul Gottfried, James Burnham, and Thomas Sowell. The running theme is that these intellectuals strain at length to come up with a way to intellectually defend and justify conservatism, only they repeatedly fail at that effort and have nothing to say regarding what the actual root principles of conservatism are. The fundamental reason I think why conservatives cannot come up with any intellectual principles is because they're ultimately just trying to defend various kinds of bigotry, and bigotry, by its very nature, is anathema to justification and evidence. Conservatives proclaim that America is a land of liberty and that it's the most free country in the world. Yet our government spies on us, and they crack down on both left and right-wing demonstrations, such as pro-Palestine rallies, or at Charlottesville, where they crashed Antifa and the right-wing protesters together to deliberately cause an unlawful assembly. The problem has become so intense that now Trump has decided that any publicly funded college that endorses Palestine or critical race theory has its funding cut. I'm not saying that I support critical race theory or that I disapprove personally of the government cutting funding to colleges that host it, but this does expose serious hypocrisy on the part of conservatives that proclaim that the right to free expression is a traditional American value, and then argue that colleges that teach subjects they don't like ought to be censored and sanctioned. Freedom is just another conservative bigotry, which is proven by the fact that conservatives themselves don't really take it seriously as a principle. Nothing, not even their own actions, can convince them that liberty is problematic. They'll continue to, at least verbally, promulgate love for liberty, despite implicitly ratifying the view that freedom leads to the defeat of conservatism. Clearly, then, the traditional land of the free is just a false narrative. Moreover, the conservative critique of the liberal left typically casts them as extreme Marxist socialists who want to transform the free market into a central command economy. But this is just bigotry. The actual situation is completely different. The liberal left has unified around a consensus on socially democratic institutions that operate on the basis of the surplus generated by a relatively free market. Alain de Benoit, drawing from the reactionary socialist Jean-Claude Michéa, argues that those who call themselves the left in America and Europe have simply been captured by liberalism and the doctrines of the market. Reformism fails to actually facilitate its goal of the gradual transition towards socialism because it is too reliant on the market to function. Gradually, these market values seep into genuine socialists, essentially de-radicalizing them without their own knowledge. To demonstrate this fact, I would point out that breadtuber Sean, as well as Vouch, have both stated that it is good that companies adopt gender ideology and anti-racism in order to expand their markets to more prospective customers and gamers. In other words, people who consider themselves Marxists are actually declaring that a company increasing its market share and profits is an unobjectionable good, even if it's based on the commodification of identities and goods, as well as the sacralization of exchange value. One can say that this might be relatively progressive, and so even if the bourgeoisie is behind it for cynical reasons, it's accidentally beneficial. But simultaneously, these socialists present the fact of broadening market share completely uncritically and without any nuance. It's clear that these so-called socialists very much support the ideals of the market, despite having systemic criticisms of capitalism. They want a market if market incentives mean we can serve more gay black people. It's exactly as Miche stated. All elements of liberalism come together in a packaged deal, such that if you accept one of them, such as progress, you end up accepting them all, including market values. For that reason, conservatives behaving as though socially democratic policies or a form of semi-socialism or a step toward the encroachment of communism, the so-called creeping socialism, are just engaged in bigotry. What they're looking at is just a liberal capture of socialism. Their narrative that welfare states and progressive income taxes constitute the same state as the worker ownership of the means of production is self-evidently stupid. Next, we have to consider the question of crimes committed by illegal immigrants. In the age of Trump, conservatives have been increasingly vocal about what they perceive as an epidemic of crimes committed by illegal immigrants. Trump even said in 2016 that illegal immigrants are rapists. But there is much data that indicates that illegal immigrants commit fewer crimes than the native population. Conservatives, since they are liberals, have to frame the immigration issue in non-demographic terms, since all demographies are valid under liberal individualist principles. The result is that they are forced to make incorrect, bigoted arguments in order to justify restricting immigration. This is another reason why the far right is less bigoted than conservatism. The former is willing to honestly speak about immigration in pure demographic terms. The reason why they don't want illegal immigration is because it displaces native white people. But conservatives cannot make this argument while still adhering to American values, so they are stuck with the terrible bigoted arguments. Consequently, they must also acquiesce to legal immigration, since it is perfectly valid in individualistic terms, particularly that it's good for the aggregate economy and that the wealth trickles down. The conservative bigotry is itself contradictory because at once they present illegal immigrants as if they are welfare leeches, but also that they are taking American jobs en masse to such an extent that they are displacing native labor and depressing wages. Both narratives cannot be true at once. The basic reality is that immigration and the limits that the American system has set is actually beneficial to the net economy because immigrants do actually work. The better argument that the far right uses is that it's bad economically for the native working class, the class that conservatives don't really care about. Finally, I want to weigh in on the question of homosexuality. I don't consider homophobia itself to be bigotry, as there are genuinely good reasons one might be able to make to establish that society ought to shame same-sex behavior. Namely that it violates the teleological end of human life and thus is unnatural, and moreover that it tends to spread HIV at higher rates than other forms of sex. But regarding the specific problem of the cause of homosexuality, there is much conservative bigotry on this question. Today, many conservatives are actually quite accepting of LGBT identities, but there still remains a large number who believe that homosexuality is an epidemic problem that ought to be solved by the state. A particularly relevant controversy is regarding conversion therapy. Conservatives often believe that homosexuality is just a choice, and as such that a person is conditioned into being a homosexual and therefore can be conditioned out of it. But the reality of homosexuality is that it is somewhat heritable, and scientists have actually found specific genes associated with same-sex sexual behavior in humans. The highest correlation I've seen is 0.3, and it seems to hover around 0.2 on GWAS. Other studies show that male homosexuals identify as homosexuals for their entire lives, indicating that the sexual orientation is quite stable, which is what we would expect if it's caused by a significant genetic component. Other studies have found differences in brain morphology in homosexuals, such as that by Simon LeVay, in which homosexual males have a more feminine hypothalamus than straight males. Other studies indicate that homosexuality might also be caused by hypermasculinity in the brain. In addition, there are other theories such as human chimerism and the birth order effect. Ultimately, there is a panoply of evidence to support the theory that homosexuality has its origins in genetic factors. It isn't to say that there isn't an environmental component to sexuality, because all traits technically have some environmental component, but rather that conditioning is only effective if there is an underlying genetic potential for homosexual behavior. The problem with the conservative narrative is that conversion therapy isn't actually effective. Dell in 2015 is one of the best studies on this subject, with over 1,000 participants from the Latter-day Saints Church, and yet it is found that sexual orientation change efforts, or SOCE, are extremely ineffective. With regard to self-reported sexual attraction and identity ratings, only one participant out of 1,019, 0.1%, who engaged in SOCE reported both a heterosexual identity label and a Kinsey attraction score of 0, exclusively attracted to the opposite sex. As shown in Table 2, the mean Kinsey attraction, behavior, and identity scores of those reporting SOCE attempts were not statistically different from those who did not engage in an SOCE attempt. So basically, among those who indicated a change in their Kinsey score, almost none reported being devoid of same-sex attraction. In addition to being ineffective, conversion therapy also has harmful effects. A similar review of the open-ended narratives also provides additional insight into the harmful ratings assigned to various methods. Reportedly damaging aspects of SOCE included decreased self-esteem, increased self-shame, increased depression and anxiety, the wasting of time and money, increased distance from God and the church, worsening of family relationships, and increased suicidality. One example from the personal righteousness narratives illustrates therapy, meeting with the bishop, meeting with stake president, praying, fasting, etc. Nothing worked. I felt that God wasn't listening or wanted me to suffer. I felt horrible until I changed my outlook. A narrative from the ecclesiastical counseling narratives further illustrates. After being told to go on a mission to be cleansed of these feelings, resulting in relationships that intensified my same-sex activity, and then being told to get married and have children, the feelings would go away. I buried myself emotionally and spiritually. Another participant wrote, "My bishop gave me a blessing promising me that I could change. Every day I didn't change. I thought I was more a failure, more of a monster." The basic fact of the matter is that the default conservative approach to human behavior is essentially behaviorism. Julius Evola correctly observed that, quote, "behaviorism is the American religion." In other words, conservatives, more than anyone else, believe in the magical transformative power of behavioral conditioning. Their view of human nature owes much to the tabula rasa of Rousseau, and it is simply a mirror of the leftist paradigm of sociological determinism. This is one of the most persistent conservative bigotries, and it is the one that the far right does not share. The far right is perfectly happy to accept that all behaviors are heritable and that all psychological facts have an immutable basis in biology. My aim in this video is not to demonstrate that conservatives are bad people or that they're of lesser intelligence. Rather, I think that their adherence to American values and liberalism handicaps them and forces them to make bad arguments or to engage in bigotry. The advice I would give them is to educate themselves and discover alternative visions of human nature, different formulations of philosophical principles, and to expose themselves to contrary arguments as much as they can. If conservatives would engage in dialectics instead of polemics, they would advance a lot more as intellectuals. As long as conservatives see themselves as obstinate opponents of everything the left says, they will continue to neuter themselves intellectually and politically. To build a stable set of conservative principles requires that you have a coherent vision of what a human being is and what foundations a truly conservative government can be built on. The more you expose yourself to alternatives, the more you learn and grow as a political actor. It's time to stop being a bigot.